A reserved table goes quiet in a French dining room on Lenox Avenue, and the street outside keeps moving like nothing changed. A man eats as if the city is not collapsing. Waiters watch their hands, not his face. Across the avenue, hunger stays in its place. In Harlem, money is supposed to hide. Here, it sits under bright glass and asks to be seen. The photographs do not show a crime. They show permission. They show that the rules are already bent. Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson is at the center of that room, not as a guest, as a signal. If his wealth can live this openly, who decided no one would touch it? On a Monday morning, a sealed envelope lands on a desk in the Bronx. It is addressed to Dutch Schultz. The handwriting is familiar. The man who wrote it is already missing. No one calls the police first. They call his home. They ask his wife. They ask the men who ran with him. They ask the corners where he used to stand. He does not answer. His car is not wrecked. His pockets are not found turned inside out on some sidewalk. There is no blood in the street. There is only absence, and a letter that arrives like a receipt. The envelope has no return address. No stamp that matters. Just a private delivery. A private message. A confession written in the voice of a man who does not get to speak anymore. The words inside are neat. Careful. Too careful. They do not read like panic. They do not read like a man running. They read like a man being managed. The paper says he is sorry. It says he regrets putting hands on a woman connected to Harlem. It says he understands consequences now. It says goodbye. And the signature at the bottom makes it worse. Patrick O'Brien. A man in Schultz's circle. A man with a job that requires nerve. A man who knew what it meant to cross a line. In the underworld, men disappear for money. For betrayal. For talking. But this one is different. Because the letter does not beg. It does not bargain. It performs. It explains the insult. And it announces the punishment. Without describing it. Without giving the police a single thing to hold. The most important part is what is missing. There is no location. There is no witness. There is no body. There is no proof of force. Just handwriting. Just timing. And a quiet understanding that the city will not solve it. The wife files a missing person report. That is what a wife can do. She gives a name. She gives the last time she saw him. She waits for a patrolman to pretend he cares. Days pass. Then weeks. The file goes thin. Because the case has nothing solid. No crime scene. No weapon. No suspect standing in daylight. The police look. They find no evidence of foul play. And the absence stays official. But the message is unofficial. And everyone reads it the same way. Schultz reads it the same way. At first, there is confusion. That part matters. A smart man does not panic when he sees ink. He checks the angle. He tests the meaning. He tries to understand why a loyal enforcer would apologize. Why he would resign from life on paper. But within minutes, the confusion ends. Because the home telephone tells him what the envelope will not. O'Brien did not come back. O'Brien did not report in. O'Brien did not collect pay. O'Brien did not drink, brag, or curse his way into the next night. He simply stopped existing. And now his handwriting is sitting in Schultz's office. A goodbye written as if it were voluntary. That is when the letter stops being a letter and becomes a threat. Not shouted. Not decorated. Delivered. Cold. The letter does not have to say a name. But the underworld supplies it anyway. The men around Schultz supply it. The men in Harlem supply it. Later witnesses supply it. This was not an accident. This was not anger. This was a demonstration. A piece of psychological warfare. A way to confirm a killing without confirming anything. A way to force a man to participate in his own disappearance. A way to make the employer feel it, without giving him a target he can take to court. The people who handle violence for a living understand that difference. Because violence is common. But discipline is rare. Anyone can pull a trigger. Not everyone can design a message. Not everyone can remove a person so cleanly that even rumor has nothing to point at. And not everyone can make the victim write the warning himself. In Harlem, the story spreads before the paperwork dries. It moves through barbershops, through backrooms, through numbers runners, through doormen who hear everything. It becomes a sentence men repeat to each other when they need to stay careful. It becomes a reminder that certain lines are not just social. They are structural. Touch the wrong person. Disrespect the wrong woman. Put your hands where they do not belong. And the city will not argue with what happens next. The most chilling part is how normal it becomes. A missing man. A wife with questions. A police file with no answers. In a criminal office where the only evidence is a sheet of paper. One line of it lands hardest, because it sounds like it was written for an audience. A farewell that is too polished, too complete. A final bow. A forced performance. I apologize for the problems I have created. Silence follows it. because the men reading it know what it costs to write that sentence. And then another line. Shorter, sharper, a line that tries to make the punishment sound deserved. This letter is to wish you goodbye. There is no goodbye without control. There is no apology without pressure. There is no confession without someone standing close enough to demand it. When the envelope is finished being read, it is no longer evidence. It is a warning that has already worked. Because the next men in Schultz's orbit will remember it. They will remember that O'Brien vanished without a struggle anyone can describe. They will remember that Harlem can answer disrespect with something cleaner than a street war. They will remember that a message can be more dangerous than a bullet. And behind that message sits a single idea. Protection. Enforced. Not negotiated. A reputation built on what cannot be proved. And what cannot be undone. A reputation tied to one name. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. Harlem, New York. In the early years of the Depression, the city has two climates. Downtown has marble lobbies and quiet elevators. Uptown has cold stairwells and landlords who still want cash. Across the country, men line up for bread. Families build shacks from scrap wood. Work disappears in plain sight. 25%. That number hangs over everything. In Harlem, the pressure is older than the crash. It is baked into the sidewalks. The North promised distance from the South. It did not promise equality. It offered different rules. More paperwork. More uniforms. More doors that close without an argument. For black men, the respectable jobs are narrow. Porter, elevator operator, driver, kitchen work. The pay is small. The hours are long. And the ceiling is permanent. If a man wants to rent a better apartment, he needs a signature. If he wants credit, he needs a white guarantor. If he wants to start a business, he needs permits. And permits move through political hands. Those hands are not neutral. They belong to precinct captains. They belong to ward bosses. They belong to judges who recognize names before they recognize facts. There is an unwritten law in New York. Police decide what is illegal. And they decide when it matters. A raid is not just enforcement. It is a transaction. A warning. A reminder. Harlem learns to live inside that system because it has to. Every neighborhood creates its own economy. Harlem's is built from small bills. Coins. Folded paper passed through barbershops and beauty parlors. A stream of bets. A stream of hope. Policy. Numbers. It is not respectable, but it is reliable. It does not require a bank loan. It does not require permission. It requires reach. It requires collectors who can walk blocks without being stopped. It requires women behind counters who can remember faces. It requires a payout system that never fails. Because the one unforgivable sin in that business is refusing to pay. In public, politicians call it vice. In private, they count it as income. The same men who talk about law and order accept envelopes. They accept campaign contributions. They accept favors. The arrangement is simple. You operate. You share. You stay within the boundaries they set. And if you refuse, they do not have to arrest you to destroy you. They can lean on your landlord. They can squeeze your runners. They can send uniformed men to stand in your doorway until customers stop coming. Power in Harlem is not only money. It is access. To police. To courts. To the men who decide which complaints get heard. In that world, white New York remains the final authority. Not always present. Always looming. Wall Street may be collapsing, but it still speaks louder than Lenox Avenue. A white investigator can bring federal pressure. A white prosecutor can ignore local arrangements. A white newspaper can turn a neighborhood into a headline. And headlines create heat. Heat makes everyone nervous. Even the men who think they own the streets. But Harlem also has its own code. Because when formal power is tilted, informal power becomes law. Respect is currency. Silence is protection. Loyalty is insurance. A man who feeds families can buy patience. A man who pays rent for a widow can buy witnesses who see nothing. A man who employs dozens can create a small army without uniforms. The neighborhood watches who gives, and it watches who takes. Outsiders can enter, but they are measured, not by what they say, by what they demand. Harlem understands exploitation. It has lived under it. So when a figure arrives with money and force, the first question is not whether he is violent. The question is whether he is of Harlem, or whether he is simply using it. There is another unwritten law. No one rises alone. Not here. A young man can be smart. He can be fearless. He can even be ruthless. But without protection above him, he is just a target waiting to be selected. And protection is a ladder with missing rungs. At the bottom are runners earning small weekly pay. At the top are operators who can move money like water. Between them are enforcers, collectors, Men who handle disputes. Men who settle debts without writing anything down. This is where ambition goes when the legal economy offers only survival. This is where discipline becomes more valuable than rage. This is where violence is not celebrated. It is budgeted, planned, used sparingly when it serves a purpose. Because too much blood brings attention, and attention brings federal eyes. Harlem in those years is a place of contrasts. Church steps on Sunday, backrooms on Monday, elegance in certain restaurants, poverty in the blocks behind them. A neighborhood forced to invent its own version of wealth, and its own version of order. And this was the world Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson lived in. Charleston, South Carolina. He was born into a place where poverty was not an event. It was a system. His father worked the docks. His mother cleaned other people's houses. The pay was small, 8 to 10 a week, 5 to 6 a week. Those numbers meant something simple. No margin, no cushion, no escape. Food was measured. Clothes were worn until they failed. The house did not offer comfort. It offered survival. Then the family moved north. Harlem. The promise was not wealth. It was distance. Distance from the South. Distance from certain kinds of danger. But the city did not open its hands. It tightened them. Rent cost more. Everything cost more. And the jobs available to black families still lived at the bottom. His father became a porter. 12 a week. His mother cleaned again. 8 a week. 2 incomes. 1 life. Still no room. School did not feel like a ladder. It felt like a delay. He attended when he could. He worked when he had to. He watched the men who did everything right. He watched where they ended up. Small rooms. Long shifts. Old age with nothing saved. He learned early that legitimate did not mean possible. It meant permitted. And permission was never guaranteed. By his mid-teens, he understood the math. A colored man could work every day of his life. He could still die owing money. That is the kind of knowledge that changes a person without noise. It does not arrive with a single decision. It arrives the way winter arrives. Slow. Certain. By the time he reached his 20s, Harlem had already taught him what the streets rewarded. Not effort. Leverage. Not honesty. Control. And then he met the woman who owned the most important kind of control in Harlem. Stephanie St. Clair, the Madam Queen of Policy. She did not build her business on chaos. She built it on structure. Cash flows. Payout schedules. Discipline. The story of how he came to her is disputed. Later sources offered different versions. Some said he intervened in a robbery. Some said she noticed him because he stood his ground. The details change. The result does not. He entered her orbit. And he became useful. At first, he was labor. A runner. A face in the crowd. Then he became something else. Protection. Enforcement. A man who could make problems disappear without creating new ones. By the time he was fully in her service, the money changed. 200 a week. That number was not just income. It was a message. It said he was no longer trapped inside his parents' ceiling. It said the street economy was not theoretical. It worked. But the pay was not the real education. St. Clair taught him how the machine ran. She taught him what policy really was. A business that turned small bets into steady profit. A business that needed credibility more than it needed charm. Because credibility meant winners got paid. Every time. She taught him the other structure. Protection did not come from being feared. It came from being connected. Police captains did not need to love you. They needed to be fed. Monthly payments. 500. 1,000. Those numbers were not bribes in Harlem. They were operating costs. The political men were the same. District leaders. Campaign contributions. Friendly judges. Cases that died quietly. Arrests that led nowhere. That was not luck. That was an arrangement. And St. Clair treated it like an agreement that required maintenance. She also taught him how violence was supposed to work. Not as rage. As policy. Controlled. Purposeful. A tool. A last step. Used to remove an obstacle. Used to send a signal. But never used so carelessly that it invited federal attention. Because local corruption could only protect you from local pressure. The federal government did not need Harlem's permission. Neither did headlines. St. Clair understood something else, too. Community. She employed Harlem. Collectors. Runners. Clerks. People who had no other path to decent money. She gave them pay. She gave them dignity. She gave them small forms of stability. And in return, the neighborhood protected her. Not because she was clean. Because she was theirs. That was power that guns could not buy. And he watched it closely. He learned that loyalty could be engineered. That silence could be purchased without threats. That charity could be a shield. That a criminal operation could still present itself as opportunity. He learned the difference between a gangster and an operator. One uses fear. The other uses systems. By the late 20s, his income was already beyond normal Harlem life. $15,000 a year. That figure placed him in a different category. But even then, it was still a wage. A high wage. A wage. And a wage means you serve someone else's structure. It means your ceiling is still real. It just sits higher. What St. Clair gave him was not just money. She gave him a blueprint. And once a man has a blueprint, he starts seeing the city differently. He starts counting. He starts mapping. He starts thinking in assets, not days. He starts imagining what it would look like to own the whole machine. Then, late in 1928, he vanished. Late in 1928, Harlem kept moving. But he did not. He stopped showing up. He stopped being seen on the corners where men like him were always seen. No farewell. No explanation. No public rupture with St. Clair. Just an empty space where his presence had been predictable. In that business, absence is never neutral. It is either flight, or imprisonment, or a decision made by someone else. Later accounts disagree on the details, but they agree on the shape of it. He was gone for roughly 16 months. Long enough for rivals to test boundaries. Long enough for allies to wonder if he was finished. Long enough for the streets to rewrite his name into past tense. When he returned, he did not come back like an employee. He came back like a man who had been recalibrated. He had money. Not a few hundred. Not a few thousand. Real cash. 75,000. 100,000. Those figures moved through Harlem like a rumor with teeth. Because money that size is not earned slowly. Not in that time. Not by a man who had just disappeared. It suggests something bigger. A score. An arrangement. A sponsor. Or work done in another city where the rules were different. He also returned with a different kind of posture. Not louder. Not more emotional. More certain. As if he had seen what national crime looked like from the inside. As if he understood that Harlem was not the whole map. Just one piece of it. Later sources called it the Chicago period. Not because anyone filed an itinerary, but because the logic points there. Chicago was where organization had hardened. Where white and black operations negotiated by necessity. Where street work met structure. Where men learned that violence could be outsourced. That money could be laundered through property. That the real power was not the gunman. It was the man who could replace the gunman without interruption. Whatever he did in that missing stretch, the return is what matters. He came back with capital. He came back with connections outside Harlem. He came back with knowledge he did not have before. The kind of knowledge that turns a talented enforcer into a builder. In early 1930, he did not wait for permission. He started buying. Small policy banks first. Operators weakened by the Depression. Men who could not keep enough cash to pay winners when the wrong number hit. He offered them relief. And he offered it fast. He spent around $40,000 in that first wave. 6 banks. Not as trophies. As infrastructure. Those purchases did something important. They turned his cash into flow. They created weekly intake. They created payroll. They created loyalty. And loyalty is easier to buy when you pay more than the next man. He hired people away from competitors. Collectors. Enforcers. Runners who knew the neighborhoods. He offered higher weekly pay. He built a crew of around 30. Not friends. Employees. Men loyal to his money, not to someone else's legend. At the same time, he started buying buildings. Not mansions. Not showpieces. Apartment houses. Places that produced rent. Places that offered quiet rooms for business. Places where a landlord could not threaten to throw you out because you were the landlord. 3 buildings. Around 60,000. That is not a hobby purchase. That is a strategy. Real estate was not just income. It was insulation. It was also a way to store wealth where police could not easily seize it. Cash gets taken. Property stays. Then he built his own protection network. Separate from St. Clair. Not because he hated her. Because independence requires separate wires. He made initial payments. He introduced himself to the right precinct men. He gave politicians reasons to remember him. He created a new set of obligations. Quiet ones. By the end of 1930, he had carved out a share of Harlem's policy business. Not the majority yet, but enough to matter. 15%. That figure meant something. It meant he could absorb a bad week. It meant he could fund expansion. It meant he could hurt rivals by paying better and moving faster. It meant he was no longer just inside the machine. He was building his own. Then 1931 arrived, and the Depression did what it did best. It weakened people with less reserve. Smaller operators began to fail. Not because demand disappeared, because they could not carry risk. In policy, risk is not abstract. Risk is the day the winning number hits and a bank does not have cash ready. That is when the crowd turns. That is when trust collapses. That is when an operator is finished. He exploited that weakness with the precision of a man who had planned for it. He bought more banks. He bought them cheap. Operations worth 50 to 75,000. He paid 20 to 30. Not because he negotiated brilliantly, because the sellers were desperate. And desperation cuts value. For those who refused to sell, the pressure changed. Not loud, not chaotic, targeted. A bank gets robbed. A collector gets beaten. A family receives a message that does not need to be repeated. The point is never the violence itself. The point is the decision it forces. Sell, or be pushed out. Most chose to sell. A few did not. Those were the ones who became examples. Later accounts say at least 8 operators died between January and September of that year. The killings were not solved. Witnesses did not testify. Investigations stalled. And when people whispered his involvement, the whispers did not become charges. That is what political protection buys. Not innocence. Distance. In the same period, he added another layer. Protection payments from businesses. Grocers. Barber shops. Restaurants. A weekly tax. 10. 25. Small amounts that add up when the territory is wide. That money served 2 purposes. It produced revenue, and it bound the neighborhood's storefronts to his stability. A shop that pays protection wants the protector to remain in control. A shop that benefits from policy traffic wants the policy to keep running. It becomes mutual interest, not love. Interest. While his policy share grew, his property holdings grew faster. He bought more lots, more buildings, commercial spaces, apartment houses, an investment wave that moved into the hundreds of thousands. Around 500,000 in Harlem real estate. That number was not a luxury. It was a fortress made of deeds. By the end of 1931, his income had shifted into a different category. Not thousands. Millions. 1.5. 2. Those figures are not simply profit. They are power. Because they allow you to buy silence. They allow you to buy speed. They allow you to correct mistakes without collapsing. They allow you to fight. That was the year his lifestyle began to change in ways that could not be ignored. A brownstone in Sugar Hill. A price that made real estate men stare. 85,000. A purchase that said he was no longer hiding. It said he was planting a flag on Harlem's most prestigious ground. Then the spending that made people talk. The automobile. The expensive lunches. The diamond ring. Not because he needed them. Because he wanted the neighborhood to see that the climb was complete. And once a man starts showing wealth that openly, it attracts something he cannot control. Attention. From rivals. From newspapers. From outsiders who believe Harlem is available. By the time 1932 approached, he had moved from rising force to obvious target. And Dutch Schultz was the kind of outsider who did not ask permission. Schultz did not arrive in Harlem as a tourist. He arrived as an owner. Downtown money. Downtown muscle. A man used to taking territory and calling it business. He had already built a reputation in New York for being relentless. Not loud. Relentless. He understood one central fact about the Depression. People still gambled. Sometimes they gambled more. Because hope is cheaper than food. And policy was the purest form of that market. Small bets. Huge volume. Cash every day. Harlem's numbers business was not a side hustle. It was an engine. And Schultz wanted it. He did not need to understand Harlem's social code to understand the math. He saw a neighborhood full of steady intake. He saw operators who were black and politically protected. He saw a system that, from his angle, looked like it could be purchased or crushed. His first move was not a public invasion. It was pressure. Quiet economic warfare. Runners get stopped. Banks get raided. Collections get interrupted. Men doing routine work start getting hurt on the way home. Not theatrical. Functional. The point was to make the business unreliable. Because unreliability is poison in policy. If players believe payouts might fail, they move their bets. If collectors believe they might get hit, they stop collecting. If bankers believe they might be arrested every week, they sell. Schultz used that logic like a lever. He sent enforcers into Harlem with instructions that did not require speeches. Break the rhythm. Break the confidence. Make the neighborhood feel like its own operators cannot protect it. That is how you take territory without announcing a war. But Harlem was not empty ground. It already belonged to someone. By 1932, Johnson had built more than a policy operation. He had built layered control. Cash. Employees. Real estate. Political wires. Community loyalty. Those are defensive assets. And Schultz, for all his resources, was an outsider. He could buy violence. He could not buy belonging. At first, Schultz believed the size of his machine would solve that. More men. More money. More replacements. He believed Harlem would fold under sustained pressure. Because most places do. And for a moment, It looked like it might work. Johnson's people started getting hit. His collectors got scared. Banks faced disruption. Small operators who depended on his stability began to panic. A few considered switching sides. That is what pressure does. It creates doubt. Then Johnson answered. Not with speeches. With rhythm. He kept payouts moving. He kept collectors paid. He kept the business functioning. He used his cash reserves the way a legitimate corporation uses liquidity in a crisis. He covered losses. He absorbed disruptions. He paid winners without delay. That alone was a statement. It told Harlem the machine still worked. And then the other answer came. The one Schultz respected. His men began to die. Not in dramatic mass killings. Not in ways that drew crowds. In ways that created fear inside his own ranks. Because his enforcers were not from Harlem. They did not have home field protection. They did not have neighbors watching for them. They walked into streets that did not belong to them. And they started to vanish. Or they were found too late to talk. Schultz could replace bodies. But replacement does not replace confidence. When men start asking whether Harlem is worth it, the machine slows. Johnson understood something Schultz did not. Harlem was not just territory. It was a population with memory. The neighborhood saw Schultz as an exploiter. A white gangster reaching into black cash flow. A man who would take the profits and leave the pressure behind. That perception mattered. Because perception is what determines silence. And silence is what determines whether police cases go anywhere. Johnson's people could disappear someone, and the neighborhood would not cooperate. Schultz's people could do the same thing, and Harlem would talk. If not to police, then to rivals. Then to the people who counted favors. Then to the political men who suddenly had a problem. Because a war in Harlem does not stay in Harlem. Not when newspapers can smell it. Not when city politicians have elections to win. Not when federal men start to notice patterns. Schultz escalated anyway. He believed brutality would finish it. That is the trap of big resources. It makes a man think escalation is always the solution. But escalation creates heat. And heat attracts attention. Johnson's answer stayed controlled. Purposeful. He did not need to outgun Schultz. He needed to outlast him. He needed to make Harlem expensive. He needed to make every step Schultz took produce less profit and more risk. The pressure turned into a test of logistics. Who could keep paying? Who could keep staffing? Who could keep operating while under attack? Schultz had deeper pockets. Johnson had deeper roots. And roots are harder to cut than men. By late September of that year, Schultz pulled back. Not because he was convinced. Because Harlem was no longer profitable. His men were dying faster than he could stabilize morale. His pressure campaign was not producing surrender. And the political cost was rising. Withdrawal is not defeat in court. But in the underworld, it is read as a verdict. It told the city something important. A young black operator in Harlem had resisted a white gangster with greater resources. And he had done it without collapsing his business. That changed Johnson's position overnight. It expanded his control. It erased certain rivals who had been waiting for him to weaken. It hardened his reputation. Not as a flashy spender. As a man who could not be moved. After Schultz left, Johnson's share of Harlem policy swelled. Not because he asked politely. Because fear and opportunity filled the vacuum. Operators who had wavered returned. Smaller banks sold out. Collectors chose the side that looked permanent. By the time the photographs in that French restaurant were taken, the message was already known. Harlem had a king. And the king was spending like the country was not starving. $50 on lunch. A permanently reserved corner table. Wine poured while bread lines grew. A diamond ring that cost more than most families would ever see. And beyond the restaurant, beyond the cars and jewelry, a quieter fact carried the real weight. The machine underneath it all was now too big to ignore. It generated millions. It employed Harlem. It paid off the right people. And it made Bumpy Johnson a headline. Not because he committed a crime. Because he committed a public act of power. He let the city see the fortune. And he dared it to explain how he was allowed to keep it. The New York Herald did not send a reporter to shame Maurice for the food. They sent him for confirmation. A rumor can live for years in Harlem. A photograph can end it in a day. The restaurant sits on Lenox Avenue like a private room with a public door. French service. Soft lighting. A cost structure designed to keep most people outside. Inside, the city's collapse becomes background noise. The paper's investigator watched the corner table. Not because it was marked. Because it was protected. A table that stayed reserved. A table that did not need a name card. Waiters moved around it like it was permanent. Harlem's criminals and Harlem's legitimate men both knew where it was. They came to see it. They came to be seen near it. And then Johnson arrived. He did not rush. He did not scan the room like a hunted man. He sat like a man whose threats had already been handled. The bill came later. $50 for a single lunch. That number mattered in 1932. It was not an indulgence. It was a broadcast. On his hand, a diamond ring caught the light. 3.5 carats. Platinum. $20,000. That number mattered even more. Because it was not worn as private joy. It was worn as proof. The Herald story was built to do one thing. Translate underworld power into figures the public could understand. They did not write about whispers. They wrote about assets. They wrote about purchasing. They wrote about property. They wrote about the speed at which a fortune appeared. 27 years old. 7 years of ascent. 8 million in total wealth. That figure did not stay inside Harlem. It crossed the river. It landed on desks downtown. It reached federal ears. Treasury men had already been tracking the pattern. Not because they cared about Harlem's morals. Because money leaves tracks. Even when it is carried in envelopes. Even when it is stored in buildings. Even when it is disguised as rent. Their estimate matched what the paper wanted to print. 8 million. And what bothered them was not only the size. It was the velocity. 1 million in wealth creation per year. During a national collapse. During a period when average wages sat under 1,000 a year. The Herald built a catalog. Not of crimes. Of consumption. The car came first. A Duesenberg Model J, custom ordered. $25,000. Burgundy paint. Hand-stitched leather. Bulletproof glass. Chrome bright enough to announce him before the door opened. In Harlem, the Duesenberg was not transportation. It was a moving headline. And it was not alone. 5 vehicles total. A Cadillac V16. $8,000. Reinforced steel. Bulletproof glass. A Packard 12 for routine errands. $5,000. 2 more cars for the security detail. $5,000 combined. $43,000 in automobiles. That figure had a simple implication. It meant he could buy 40 average homes and still drive them all to dinner. Then the paper turned to jewelry. Not a watch. A collection. Platinum pocket watches. 4 of them. 2,500 each. 10,000. A diamond wristwatch from Cartier. 8,000. Cufflinks. 12 sets. 1,500 each. 18,000. Money clips. Tie pins. Accessories. 10,000. Gold chains. Gifts. Miscellaneous pieces. 7,000. And the ring that anchored the whole story. 20,000. Because that ring had a narrative. A Fifth Avenue jeweler. A customer list built from white money. A quote that began at 18,000. And a buyer who insisted it rise. Not for function. For the number. 20,000. So he could say it. So he could own the sentence. Then the paper moved to clothing. Not style. Inventory. A custom Harlem tailor. 400 to 500 per suit. Over 100 suits. That math was not subtle. 45,000 in suits alone. Custom shoes. 50 pairs. 25 each. 6,250. Silk shirts. 200. 30 each. 6,000. Hats. Gloves. Silk ties. All stacked into a wardrobe large enough to require staff. A valet. A personal barber. 3 visits a week. 25 per visit. 3,600 a year. That figure sat like a quiet insult in a city where families survived on less. Then the paper went to the house. Sugar Hill. Edgecombe Avenue. A 4-story brownstone. Purchased for 85,000. In a market where comparable properties sold for 30 to 40. The premium was the point. Prestige. Urgency. And design. Construction that could be reinforced. A private garage. Sightlines for security. It was not a home. It was a command post with a dining room. And he did not stop at purchase. Renovations. Furnishings. 75,000 more. Steel doors. Bulletproof windows. 15,000. A hidden safe room behind a moving bookshelf. 8,000. European furniture. 20,000. Persian rugs. Artwork. Decorative items. 18,000. Lighting. Security modifications. 14,000. The residence ran with staff like a small hotel. A cook. 40 per week. A housekeeper. 35. A driver. 50. A valet. 45. A 24-hour guard. 60. Annual payroll. 11,960. Then the operating costs. Utilities. Food. Wine. Maintenance. 2,000 a month. 24,000 a year. And a private collection of illegal French wine. 15,000. Again, the paper did not frame this as pleasure. It framed it as scale. Because scale is what makes law enforcement pay attention. Finally, it returned to Chez Maurice. 5 or 6 meals a week. 45 to 50 a meal. Tips that doubled the bill. An annual restaurant expense in the range of 12 to 14,000 at that one location. And more spending elsewhere. 6 to 8,000. Total, 18 to 22,000 a year just to be seen eating. Then the nightlife. Permanent tables. The Cotton Club, 2,000 a year. The Savoy, 1,500. Champagne nights, 500 to 1,000 in a single evening. Musicians tipped like employees, 50, 100. Annual entertainment, 15 to 18,000. Total dining and entertainment, 33 to 40,000. The Herald's conclusion did not need a sermon. The numbers were the sermon. A nation shrinking, one man expanding, a public that could not understand the mechanics behind it, a city that pretended it did not see, and an underworld that understood exactly what it meant. Because this was not simply wealth. It was protected wealth. And once protection becomes visible, it invites a different kind of danger. Not from police. From attention that cannot be bribed with cash. The Herald's investigation ended with a question it could not answer. How a fortune like that is built in 7 years. And who decided it could remain untouched? On the night after locked door, Paddy O'Brien did not go home. He left a room. He entered a car. He stopped being seen. There was no gunfire in the street. No crowd. No chase. No ambulance. Just a gap in routine. That is how removals happen when the point is control, not spectacle. The next morning, his wife waited for the familiar sounds. A key. A step. A voice. Nothing arrived. She called the men who worked with him. They gave her answers that did not answer anything. She called again. They stopped picking up. By the following day, she went to the police. She filed a missing person report. She described the last time she saw him. She described his clothes. She described his habits. The officer wrote it down. He did not look surprised. A missing man is not always a crime. Not in New York. Not when the missing man lives near the edge of people who do not appear in court. The police asked questions. Not many. They checked hospitals. They checked jails. They found nothing. No booking slip. No accident report. No admission record. No body in a morgue. Nothing that turned absence into a case. 2 days after O'Brien vanished, a sealed envelope reached an office in the Bronx. It was delivered by hand. No return address. No proof of origin. The name on the front was enough. Mr. Dutch Schultz. The handwriting was recognized immediately. O'Brien's handwriting. That was the first consequence. Because the message did not come from Harlem in Schultz's language. It came in the voice of a man who was already gone. Schultz opened the envelope. He read the letter. According to later witnesses, his face changed without movement. The room went quiet around him. The letter did not threaten. It explained. It apologized. It resigned from life. And it did it with a neatness that felt manufactured. It named the insult. It admitted the mistake. It accepted the price. Then it tried to make the ending sound voluntary. This letter is to wish you goodbye, Mr. Schultz. Silence. Schultz did what men like him do when they see a trap. He verified. He called O'Brien's home. His wife answered. She confirmed the report. O'Brien had been missing since the night before. No call. No note. No sighting. Schultz ended the call knowing the letter had already done its work. Because the letter was proof without evidence. It confirmed a killing without giving the police a crime scene. It confirmed retaliation without identifying the hand that delivered it. It forced a confession without creating a witness who could testify. It also did something else. It made Schultz participate. He had to read the goodbye. He had to absorb it. He had to accept that one of his men had been taken on another man's terms. Schultz tried to respond the only way he knew. He offered rewards. He pressured people to talk. He pushed the police to look harder. He sent his own men to search places where bodies sometimes appear. Rivers. Basements. Vacant buildings. The edges of the city where trash gets dumped. But there was no discovery. There was no accidental find. There was no loose tongue in a bar. The disappearance held. Harlem heard about it before the police finished their first round of questions. It moved in fragments. A whisper in a back room. A sentence at a barber shop. A look exchanged between collectors when a name was mentioned. The story became simple. A bodyguard hit Stephanie St. Clair. The bodyguard vanished. That simplicity was part of the design. Because a clean story travels further than a complicated one. And it lands harder. It taught a rule without posting it on a wall. Do not touch the woman under protection. Do not embarrass the people who keep Harlem's cash flowing. Do not assume race makes you untouchable in a black neighborhood. The police kept O'Brien's case open for a short time. They interviewed his wife. They spoke to a few associates. They wrote down what they could. They found no clear evidence of foul play. No weapon. No blood. No witness willing to attach a name to an accusation. The file thinned. The urgency faded. The city moved on to the next problem. That was the second consequence. The disappearance became unofficial truth. Everyone in the criminal world understood what happened. Everyone also understood the second part. No one was going to say it out loud, because saying it out loud turns rumor into testimony. And testimony creates obligations. Court dates, cross-examinations, retaliation. Harlem had learned how to survive inside that system. When a message is meant to protect the neighborhood's order, silence becomes a form of agreement. O'Brien's wife lived with an empty chair and an open question. Schultz lived with something worse. He lived with the fact that his power had been answered, not with a gunfight, with a disappearance, a letter, and a missing body that refused to surface. The underworld remembers events like this because they compress law into one image. A man writes his own goodbye. A messenger delivers it. A boss reads it. And the city provides no remedy. The consequence was not only that O'Brien was removed. The consequence was that the removal could not be challenged without risking more losses. That was the point. Fast, cold, non-dramatic. A man was there. Then he was not. No one was ever charged. By October, the story had been simplified into photographs. A man at a corner table. A diamond ring catching light. A lunch that cost $50. In a country where families were losing homes. In a city where men stood in bread lines. The Herald framed it as investigation. But Harlem read it as confirmation. Because the real power was not the food. It was the permission to spend like that and remain standing. 8 million in estimated wealth. Assets that looked like legitimate tycoon money, built in 7 years. Cars that announced him blocks before he arrived. A house on Sugar Hill reinforced like a fort. A private staff paid more than whole families could earn. A life engineered to be seen. That visibility changed the board. It drew federal attention. It drew rivals looking for leverage. It drew politicians looking for a share. And it drew young men in Harlem who understood the message clearly. Legitimate work was a ceiling. This was the other ladder. But the ladder came with rules. Payouts never fail. Protection stays paid. Violence stays controlled. Community stays fed. And outsiders get reminded, quickly, that Harlem is not open territory. The Dutch Schultz withdrawal did not end conflict. It changed the reputation. Johnson was now the man who could withstand downtown pressure. The man who could make enemies disappear without leaving evidence. The man who could buy buildings while the city collapsed. The man who could sit under chandeliers while Harlem watched from the street. The Herald wanted a morality tale. Harlem saw something colder. A new kind of American success, built on illegal math and disciplined force, operating in daylight because the system around it had already made room. And once that kind of success becomes public, it creates one last problem. The more people who see it, the more people start thinking they can take it.